So COP30, which is the Conference of the Parties, the climate conference per se, as is known, was in a city called Belem in the state of Pará in Brazil. And this is basically referred to as the entrance to the Amazon. I think there's other cities with that moniker, but it's a large Amazon. So it was sort of like on the river, very next to the jungle. And getting there was, you know, a adventure in itself, like flying from here to California to, I think, Houston to Sao Paulo, then back north to Berlin. It was very interesting because it was a city that's not really set up for this, and there was a lot of discourse around that, whether it was set up for this type of large organization, large conference. We have seen in the last couple of years, and actually we heard conversations leading up to this conference about the suitability of places like this, because we've seen in the last couple of years a move towards hosting these very large conferences in smaller cities that may or may not have the frameworks and the sort of infrastructure. So it's interesting because again, these are actual negotiations that are happening at the conference. It's not just speaking and glitzing. And people go until very late. If you've followed us at some of our plastics treaty negotiations, you've seen that sometimes it's 2, 3 in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning in the last one. People need to be ready, rested, and be ready to be there. And so when you have people that are having to stay very far away, etc., it really kind of cuts into that. So it was a adventure, but we got there in time, and we got there in time for the Ocean Day, which was the November 17th. So that was good. Never a dull moment. I think it was quite the extreme climate that we dealt with, although maybe that's not the case for people who live there. I come from the desert, so we're not used to this level of like deluge, so to speak. We had the week before I got there, they had torrential rains. I mean, also while I was there, but we didn't really have the level of flooding when I was there. So there was really bad flooding. There was a lot of lightning, which I'm not used to seeing. Again, doesn't mean it's not normal. It's just something that is not quite the thing for me. And we obviously had that big fire. Like I said, a lot of these things, infrastructures are having to be built purposely for some of these conferences. We saw that at UNOC as well, UNOC 3 in Nice, where we were looking at some of the more like the tenting situation. And some of the unfortunate part of that is that it may not be, as ready for some of these events, or rather some of these issues that come up. And so we had a really, really, really large and scary fire, which I will say was put out in apparently 6 or 7 minutes. So kudos on that. And, all week I was looking at, I kept wondering why they had so many firefighters. Well, I guess that's why. But kudos to the firefighters and emergency service people, because they managed to move an insane amount of people very quickly, safely, and put that out. And what happens is that when you go into the actual conference, like the main entrance, there's all these pavilions, and all these pavilions are built out, maybe not, in the most durable material, so they're very flammable, and that's what's going on. So all of that went up in flames. We had to run out. This was Thursday. It was interesting. Obviously moved things back quite a bit. Again, kudos and really our thanks to the emergency service and especially the firefighters that handled that very, very quickly. What came out of it? That's the eternal question, right? What actually was accomplished? I think that it is a bittersweet conversation because it is hard, and we posted one of the video with our rock star colleague from Panama that was talking about Juan Carlos Monterrey, that was talking about the irony of being in the Amazon, at the door of the Amazon, and not being able to have specific details and plans around deforestation and some of that what they call path forwards, and that was hard. That was hard. One of the things that I like the most is this dashboard that came out, which we'll link into it, that is basically a very specific way of measuring a lot of these new ideas that we're talking about relative to ocean climate action. That was very exciting to see because personally, I'm a very outcomes oriented person. I'm love my numbers. And so I was very excited to be able to have some measure of measures, if that makes sense. So, relative to oceans, I think the biggest thing we can celebrate from COP30 is the Ocean Task Force that was announced by Brazil and France, which is basically creating a mechanism that accelerates the incorporation of ocean solutions, again, ocean climate solutions, into the national climate plans. So, NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, this is part of negotiations. People say, this is what we're going to do. This is what you can hold me accountable for. And so it was exciting to see a very concrete path forward on how to incorporate, prioritize, and highlight ocean and ocean climate solutions, more importantly, as part of the general climate conversation. And so the first time that I saw that ocean conversation in the COPs at that level was in Paris, where we had the first like Ocean Day, and then back in 2019, that was determined to be the blue COP, largely because of like the original host Chile that was making obviously like a giant in ocean international policy and making sure that that was at the forefront. We are now starting to move forward again to concrete paths forward to actually make that operational, to make that specific, to land those things to the day to day. How do we move forward? How do we go from lovely words to fabulous actions? And so that's exciting. The other thing was like I mentioned before, the dashboard, the measuring dashboard, which kind of goes with this, right? So again, as part of this ministerial meeting, which was the high level ministerial meeting that happens right at the beginning or right before, we had this discussion, this task force, and the name says it all, right? From ambition to implementation, delivering on ocean commitments. So that's exactly what we're looking forward to from us at Azul. In Spanish, you say del plato a la boca se cae la sopa. And so it's exciting to see very good ways of making sure that, the soup does not fall away and that we're actually like taking that action and that we don't get lost in like lovely words and lack of action. So that I think is the most exciting part. So kudos to France and Brazil for making something very specific. I would say that, we had 17 countries that at the time had already taken action, including Mexico, including Chile, including other big countries like France, Australia, Palau, Seychelles, etc. This is the sort of action we want to see. Not all is bad, but is there enough? I don't know. We need to really accelerate on things like this that are specific, concrete, time bound, and detailed, and that's where the solutions are. It was it was it was bittersweet because we should have gotten more action, more specific action. It kind of feels sometimes like we keep kicking the ball down the road. And as someone that's been going to these things for a couple years. I can't imagine what the people that started on this 30 something years ago would say, but it feels sometimes like we keep kicking the ball down the road and eventually there's not going to be enough road to kick the ball down to, right? So that is the hard part. Obviously, it is an extremely complex, intricate, difficult, nuanced conversation, negotiations that are happening. And the world as it is right now is not the easiest relative to who are the big actors, who are pushing, how are we having this conversation. But I think that did we get something out of it? Yes. I am forever hopeful and thankful for the strength of civil society and some of these very progressive governments that keep pushing that conversation forward. I think that some of those that are most responsible in the sense that they have more resources, more effects, more impact should be taking significantly much more ambitious action. And so that's where we're a little bit disappointed. So we had this underlying theme, which was mutirao, the idea being collective action. And we have seen it as in other embodiments and words at other conferences. I think that we had a significantly much more present and notable theme this time around. The host government certainly made a point of bringing it up quite a bit. And actually, even in the side panels and the side conversations, it was really, really something that was brought up quite a bit. Did we take enough of that? I don't know. I don't know. That's the hard part. I think that, like I said, those that have the most resources and the most responsibility by definition should be putting more into this mutirao. But I think that in terms of the progressive governments, the rights holders, the stakeholders, the public, the civic society, We are certainly putting out as much as possible, but as with Mundial, it has to be collective action and we need to have everybody on board. And that's where we're hoping maybe people will understand better that concept and take more path forward. What I really like is the idea of really imbuing the local culture as this guideline at the global stage. So I think that's a really good way to move us forward and to have those local hosts make sure that they are bringing their best, right? So that's what Brazil and as the host government was bringing, like that ancestral knowledge, that local knowledge, that present knowledge as well, of course, right? But to bring that understanding, that traditional knowledge into the conversation, highlighting it. And I will be honest, we had issues where some folks didn't feel like they were included enough. We had protests from indigenous leaders. We had protests inside, outside. So I think that there is a conversation to be had about whether Mutirao was properly embodied, because again, this is a local indigenous concept. So I think that when we are having this at such a high level and we are using that, we have to make sure that it's not just a window dressing. And I think that's the conversation, that's a question for those groups locally and those indigenous leaders to ask them whether they felt that that was fully embodied, that that was properly embodied, that they feel included enough. I can't speak for anybody, but I would imagine that if they did, we wouldn't have had these protests, right? And frankly, having seen the response to some of the protests, I don't know that that was the full embodiment of that. So I think that when you embody that, or you try to embody, or you try to use it, frankly, a concept like this, you also acquire responsibility, right? So it cannot be an empty word, it cannot be an empty concept. And that's a question that we have to ask the indigenous leader locally. What did they think of this use of mutirao? Was it properly used? Did they fully embody it? Did they feel like included? That's a big question to be asked. In the end, do we think that COP30 delivered? Probably not, right? But as Azul, as a community-based organization, we are big fans of policy and frameworks and agreements, but at the same time understand that all of those are dead letter without people, right? I was just reminded by someone that I had told them this. Policy without people is just paper, right? So it is forever important that we continue to have that community leadership, the people leadership at the front. And so, did we get what we needed at this time? No. Um, are we disappointed? Yes. Are we disillusioned? A little bit. But are we disenfranchised? No. I mean, community keeps going. We are eternally and fully inspired and guided by community. And that was present, that was vibrant, that was strong, that was um, relentless. And that is the important part because in the end, only community saves community. Yes, one of the more exciting things of being here at these places is to be able to have like constructive, productive conversations one-on-one with decision makers. And, we have Latinos Marinos that come from a lot of countries, even if they live in the US, they're part of the diaspora, that still have, strong connections to either their family's country of origin, their country of origin, their historic sort of like ancestral country of origin. So it is very exciting to be able to have these discussions with decision makers from these countries, not just from the US, especially considering the US was not present officially. And so we were able to connect with, the governments of Peru, the government of Panama, with Mexico specifically, who held a great stakeholder roundtable for folks from all over. And we were able to sit down and have a productive discussion with not just, their staff, which is fabulous and we see at other places, but also with Alicia Bárcenas, who is head of the Environment Ministry in Mexico and actually comes from the Foreign Relations post. So she combines an extremely knowledgeable understanding of policy, environment, international fora, frameworks. And we were able, for example, at this point, they had a very nice roundtable where every single person was able to convey their concerns. And we had mothers that had a problem with the air quality in Monterrey, outside of Monterrey. We had folks that were concerned about other places in Chiapas, strong concern for the Gulf of California. And so we were able to convey some of those concerns specifically around connected to our poll results and how people in our poll of Mexican descent or Mexican origin were talking about how they did not want to see more development on the coast. They wanted to see protected areas. They wanted to see protection. They wanted to see less offshore drilling, less gas, less extraction, and again, more protection. So we were able to convey that to the minister. And so that was very exciting to see. And then we saw a fabulous panel hosted at the Chilean pavilion around the BB&J Treaty, which will be effective next January, actually, well, next month now. And so it was exciting to talk about that. Who gets to be part of that? How do we go forward? And so this is, a COP, right? Another COP. We're still waiting to see who is going to have the secretariat. I know that Chile has been a very big contender, but we don't have a president yet. Countries need to sign on to this thing and ratify it now if they want to be part of the first conference, et cetera, which then sets the rules. So it's very exciting to see not just this very esoteric idea, but the actual details of how this gets operationalized, which is the important part, right? How do we get this? Because this is where we take all the lessons learned from the climate COP where we say, okay, what did we leave to open? Some of the lessons that we're trying to incorporate into the plastics treaties, how do we make sure we don't have this loophole? How do we make sure that we really have accountability here, X, Y, and Z? And so now we see this treaty, which is further along. Again, it's coming online. It's now been ratified with enough signatures, or rather enough countries signing on, and seeing the nitty gritty of it, which to me, who comes from a background in logistics and operations, is extremely, extremely exciting to see the actual dots and the I's dotted and the T's crossed. So we saw that panel connected with the government in Peru, who again are very interested in protected areas and marine protected areas and connecting with them about what goes forward. And at the same time, hard to not see the rock stars that are Panama and their strong advocacy towards this. But again, it was a very, very good way forward to connect with a lot of these countries. These are some of the standout conversations. But again, we were able to connect with folks from all over Latin America and came back with a lot of not just inspiration ideas, but specifically working relationships and plans. We're hopeful. And again, community is where it is and what leads us forward. So that's exciting on that end. One thing that I keep drawing upon, and I think it's just very different ways of doing things, as someone that was born and grew up in Mexico and is basically shaped by this experience of community organizing, and that having my first experience through that in Mexico, I am always blown away by that community guided. And we're going to say this, and listen, it's not community an empty word. This is just actual people, right? People at the center, and environmental justice, and what we call environmental justice, which is kind of just environmentalism in other places. And I am forever inspired, renewed, and I say this in the nicest way. I don't want to sound extractive or anything like that, but I am just forever inspired, illusioned, and excited by what I keep telling people, and I think folks don't realize, is that if you talk to the average person on the street in Latin America anywhere, they're going to be significantly more cognizant of the UN processes, international fora, etc., than folks in the US. So in the US, we tend to be a little bit more, internal or domestic in our viewpoints, but that's not the case everywhere. And so what this means is that there is a significant support to some of these things that you don't necessarily see yet, or the US, or as someone who actually was reminding me yesterday, that it's a very niche thing in the US. Internationalism, Latin Americanism, etc., is very much a niche thing in the US, but it's a way of life and it's imbued in our cultures in Latin America. So it's exciting to see this fully embraced, developed, and way further along. And so that's always a guiding light for me. And it kind of brings that, especially in this time where we are seeing less of the US participating, less collaboration, less, etc., to see this continuing to go forward regardless of what's going on, and continuing to push forward and continuing to lead and to imagine and to dream. And that's again, community is what brings that up, regardless of who's in charge, what's at stake, etc. It's just this relentless push by community, because again, community is at the forefront, is dealing with it, is suffering it, or etc. So it's not a choice because people have to deal with their environment and their surroundings, and they take charge and they take action. It's a really weird situation to not have the US formally there. On one hand, one could say that depending on the administration, we could have significant support and sort of like a connective tissue in trying to bring things together. We did see other countries trying to step in and become conveners and movers on that, notably Europe. But it is sort of like a elephant in the room, right? It's hard to like pretend that like one of the biggest players financially and climate, et cetera, it's not there. And so that's hard. The US civil society was there, significantly enforced. We did see the government of California, specifically the governor of California, show up as a bit of a surrogate, which we had seen before. And again, California, which one of the largest economies in the world by itself, working and making advancing these conversations through agreements, through subnational agreements, and even with other governments at the national level, etc. So that's exciting to see someone continuing to have the conversation, but it is unfortunate because it is unfortunate to not have the US government there. Although I would also say, depending on how the US government behaves, sometimes it may be easier because maybe they're not in the way. Maybe they're, opening things, space up for other people to take charge. I genuinely think that we should not ensconce ourselves and have like any kind of dogmatic idea that only one country can do things and only one country can lead. And so that's good to see that other countries are stepping up, even if in the practical sense, it is very hard considering the amount of money that the US was putting into the UN, has put in the UN. They've talked about pulling some of it out. And that's where Congress needs to step in the US. And so you need to call your congressperson because you from your local community can help advance this. But it is a very mixed bag relative to what we get. But I think that my hope is that countries will continue to see this opportunity to take the lead and to go forward regardless and to take action that is extremely and obscenely urgent. Relative to the US being or not being there and what was happening while we're there, something that was insanely surreal is being in the middle of this climate conference where folks are endeavoring to take climate action. And we had this idea that, we had heard that this was coming, but it was surreal to see the US release new plans to significantly expand offshore drilling for oil and gas at home. And so that was something that was such a just cognitive dissonance, right? To see this urgency, to see this need purported by people from around the world, and to see the US decide, no, we're gonna like open up the entire coast of California, which hasn't been open for decades, parts of Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico, et cetera, to offshore drilling, which is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing, which is exactly the opposite of what the people tell us in our polls should be doing, which is exactly the opposite of where even Republicans all over the country are saying we should be doing. And check out Florida, and i.e., when we originally heard about this idea of expanding offshore drilling, Florida and significant parts of the East Coast were included, and the uproar was such that they took it off, and we're still seeing big pushback from the Florida governor, et cetera, which again, a Republican. So a couple of things, cognitive dissonance, like decades behind. Why are we trying to do something that we haven't done for decades? That we, as the fourth, fifth economy in the world, depending on when you check, California doesn't need to do this, right? That we have not even had any of these things done here for such a long time. And yet we are one of the strongest economies in the world, one of the biggest economies in the world. To see this idea to just push back at a time when the world is pushing forward, to try to go into old school type of things when the world is leapfrogging us with economy, like leapfrogging us in technology for new renewable energies, non-fossil fuel energies, is just insane. That was a really hard part. And that was also like the part of like seeing, well, maybe it was good that the US was not there. I don't know. Like this is a hard one, but it was very difficult to see that. And it was also difficult to see it when you're so far away and you're trying to engage. And we were somewhat prepared, but it was extremely, extremely mind-blowing to see that happening. It was very exciting to see Governor Newsom have a strong categoric response saying dead on arrival, and we hope that that's the case. We hope that our local, state government stands strong. We hope that public outcry continues to drive the conversation. And so on one hand, it was exciting to see that, but it's just insane. It was just, I don't even know what to call it, to see this decades old plan coming back to life when we should be leading in technology and innovation. Chiquitos pero picosos, I think. One thing that we find always, because we have been generally a small, nimble organization, and by small, I mean we have been at our largest, I think, 11 people. We're currently at 7. First of all, I am insanely lucky to work with a full on rosters of rock stars, and that's the part of the exciting part, right? But I think that relative to what we have seen in the COP, one thing that I have seen significantly is this mainstreaming of the conference in the movement. So whereas it was a very niche thing, it has become a significantly mainstream thing where everybody goes to conference. And somebody was talking about this in a different post about how some people even see the going to the conference as an end in itself. And I guess some people could see that. I would caution you to say that, for the most part, we're still trying to actually get things ahead. We're still trying to get routes ahead. We're still trying to get pathways forward. We're still trying to figure out the financing. We're still trying to figure out loss and damage fund, actions, proactive actions, caps, etc. So it's not just about showing up and taking a cool picture. And listen, there's a myriad of cool pictures, but that itself does not solve our climate crisis. And I can't tell other people what to do, but showing up for a cool picture does not solve the climate crisis. So we need to make sure that we're taking action, that we are showing up and taking that action ahead of time, that we are connecting it to our local activities, that we are connecting with our local electeds, that we are connecting with our local decision makers, that we are bringing it back and making it relevant to folks here. So, for example, very exciting to see California there. And you bet that I will be catching up and following up with the delegation and saying, hey, you said X, Y, and Z. How are we following up here? How does that apply here? You made this agreement there. How are we implementing it? And so that's the same thing that I would encourage people to talk about. I would encourage people to follow your favorite organization there's now one of the things that I have seen as a change as part of this mainstreaming is the amount of materials and resources that are available, which I absolutely love because it is becoming significantly more democratic. People can follow the negotiations you've always been able to follow them, but it's very arcane specific details. And now you can just obviously this has been the development of social media, digital resources, but there's significantly more ability to follow from your house, to take action from your house, to take action from your wherever it is in the world that you are. And so that itself becomes a really interesting dynamic where you go to the conference and the conference is just the center or the neural link of a large network, which should be a large network of action. So that's, I think, the upside of what I've seen that is very exciting, where it has become significantly more mainstream and more people take action. The other part is we see one of the downsides is that we see with this mainstreaming, we see a significantly bigger participation from the oil and gas lobby, which is kind of like a misnomer. And one example that people point to is that, in the tobacco conferences, we didn't allow the tobacco industry to be part of that, to take such a big part of the negotiations or even any part. And so we definitely need a better idea of how to move these conversations forward towards action that is urgently needed and that's community-centered, community-focused, community-led, right? So it's hard because the more people go, the more expensive it gets, the harder it gets to, I would say, to attend something like this. And so it's It's a hard one. I don't think it has to be either or. I don't think it has to be a zero-sum game, but it could be when you are in a location that does not have a significant amount of lodging, and that creates those sort of like problems for folks. So it's growing pains. I will always bet on the side of democratization and opening up and having more people participate, but at the same time without forgetting what we're there for, which is not cool pictures. It's concrete, specific, time-bound action to solve our climate crisis. If I were to talk to Marcela in 2010, I would say do more homework before you show up. I would say showing up to the COP, which I did at same at the time as my first time, is should be the pinnacle of a couple of months of work preparation, should be the cherry on top of a significant amount of work to take action to contribute, be it community input, be it information, policy proposals, ideas, polling, communications. That's what I would do. And I learned that very quickly in Cancun. And to understand more of the rules and to wear very comfortable shoes. This is, 16, 20-hour days. Even if you are not at all of the negotiations, and ideally you will be seeing some of them, assuming that you can get in, and you're connecting with a lot of folks, but you need to have some starting point of some specifics that again is concrete action. And those will change as you meet other people and get new ideas, but you need to start from some sort of productive point. So, in terms of like lighter conversation, one of the details that kind of permeated the whole, at least the week that I was there, and I was only there for one of the weeks, was this idea of where the next COP was going to be held, COP31. If you don't know, there is this like sort of rotation of work areas. And so, because we had it in Latin America this time, it would have to go elsewhere. And it had come down to Turkey and Australia with a couple of the small island nations. There was a significant support for Australia, I think. And something that was very funny, and I don't know if they did this on purpose or not, is that they actually put their pavilions side to side. And there was like this unofficial tally that some of us were taking because they were both, both of these countries that are like big on coffee culture. And they were having like these really big lines every morning with the coffee bars. So like some countries will set up coffee bars in their pavilions. And we were trying to figure out like, is that telling us anything? Where is things going? Like who has a bigger line? Who has better coffee? And so that was a thing that was happening in the background. And FYI, if countries cannot agree on where things are going to be held, what happens is that it goes to the site of the Secretariat, which for the climate conference is in Bonn, Germany. So the times that you have seen it be there is because people could not come to an agreement, or something wasn't being able to work out, or something got in the way, and that's why it's held there. In the end, very much at the last minute, we heard that it was Turkey that took the next COP. The driving concern there is whether we will have a significant presence from the small island nations in the Pacific. I think the agreement that they came to is that it will be held in Turkey, with Australia playing a strong role there with the small island nations. We have seen this in the past, right? Where, especially with the UN ocean conferences, where we have like a location and an actual co-host or a host. We saw it back in 2019, where we actually had COP25 that was moved sort of like a month before it happened, from Chile to Madrid, from Santiago to Madrid. And then we had Spain as the physical host, but Chile still being the actual like host of the conference. So we're starting to see a little bit of this mix and match. I don't know if they're taking a page from FIFA or it's the other way around with the co-hosting and the spreading out. But that was a really interesting, like, will there one day situation happening that whole week, and just a little bit of tidbit behind the scenes of how things are done, where they're decided. And I know that they already actually have COP32 settled for Ethiopia. So it's really interesting to see how everything is a negotiation, everything is a discussion, everything gets like sorted out, not in a very straightforward way, because when you have this global community with obviously interest and competing ideas, etc., it's not quite as straightforward, which is part of the good thing, right? Like, because we don't want to have like too hegemonic of a conversation, but that was part of the interesting thing happening in the background as all these discussions and negotiations are happening, is like that other level of negotiations, and as what we took to calling the informal coffee queue barometer.